Today we're talking about the center. Okay. One distinction between GA and traditional philosophical and theoretical thought is that GA replaces the concept of intention with the concept of attention. Intention gets you focused on the subject and the subject's constitution of the world. Attention gets you focused on an inextricable subject-object unity in which the object has the higher priority. But this is not a materialist reversal which sees the object as more real than the subject. The subject and the object are co-constituting. But even this talk about subject and object mystifies things and keeps us enclosed within traditional philosophical discourse, even if we shift to modern social and political theory, which is filled with subjects and objects taken as given and as interacting in some way. But why are there subjects and objects rather than nothing? We set off on a new course of thinking simply by acknowledging Michael Tomasello's demonstration that the most intelligent hominids, aside from humans, the great apes, don't point. This very simple activity, one that very small children can perform very early on, is impossible for animals that might be far more intelligent than those children by all kinds of measures. Two chimps can't look at something together and let each other know that they're doing so. That's really what an object is, something we could let be and look at together. And a subject, then, is that being capable of letting it be. But the discourse of subjects and objects is caught up in attaining subjective mastery over objects, which is really what intentionality is. Sometimes you may want mastery for certain purposes, but taking intentional subjective mastery over objects as your primary descriptive discourse assumes a liberal, and we could even say capitalist ontology. One, to refer to Bickler and Nitson's capital as power, of capitalization. The subject is discounted against anticipated future earnings. That's what subjective mastery over objects amounts to, a risk assessing and limiting project. Simply conceding that something evades or resists the mastery of even the most capitalizing subject, though, introduces a crack into this discourse. And one thing that escapes your mastery is the source of the intentionality informing it. Why do you want what you want? If there doesn't have to be subjects and objects, what we can shift our attention to is the process, or better, the event, that co-creates what will eventually be recognizable as subjects and objects. Built into the notion of intentionality is some deep structure of the will. Built into the notion of attention is something demanding attention and demanding you draw others' attention to it. With subjects and their intentions, and demanding that you draw others' attention to, which involves configuring ourselves around something at the center. So we start neither with subjects and their intentions, or objects and the laws governing their operations, which really just confirms the intentionality of the subject identifying and exploiting these laws, but with a center that compels. It compels in at least the minimal sense that it holds you. While you're looking at it, you're not looking away. You're looking at it because others are, or could be looking at it. Even that could be, imagining what you're looking at in terms of potential audiences, is a later development, which means you're looking back and forth between center and margin. But the center creates the margin, so you're looking at others on the margin as held by the center, just as you are. Whatever you and others may eventually do with the object, consume it, break it down and reconstruct it, use it as an ingredient of something else, turn it into an instrument, will only be imaginable and therefore possible insofar as it is represented as a way of maintaining the center margin configuration itself. This means there's a subsistent center beyond the center at which any particular thing sits. So there's the center and there's centrality, or as I've called it, the occupied center and the signifying center. And the first thing the center tells or commands us is to sustain centrality. The radical implication of this, which I've tried to remain faithful to, is that all of our thoughts and deeds are of the center, commanded by the center, carried out for the benefit of the center. History in that case is the history of the center. Phenomenologically, this can be described as follows. The center calls you to it, along with others on the scene, but therefore also tells you to coordinate your approach with those others. So as you approach the center or step back and wait, accelerate or decelerate, model for others a way of engaging or appropriating the center, or protect the center from others, each single move you make is a reading of the center. But even to call it a reading introduces too much subjectivity. So it's better to call it a hearing of the center, because you hear whether you want to or not. It's like imitating someone very closely. He raises his arm, you raise yours. He kneels, you kneel. He jumps, you jump. You need to be very focused in order to follow him. And that is our relation to the center, which we are, in fact, imitating from the beginning by participating in preserving the space the center opens up for us. Now, it's possible to say that once we have this anthropological knowledge, we can see that there's something illusory about it all. Once we realize we're always imitating someone, can't we stop doing it? Once we realize we're interested in what's at the center because others are, or we think might be, interested in it, can't we just break with the illusion that there is anything intrinsically interesting or important about what is at the center? In specific cases, yes, of course, we can shift our attention, we could break compulsions and addictions. But this very knowledge of centrality derives from a higher form of attention to a less visible and therefore more durable and in some ways more fragile center. The first break with a mode of centrality was when a human occupied the center and took control of ritual and distribution. We can assume that that development was demystifying regarding the community's commitment to its sacralized animals and ancestors. That human at the center will come to be supplied not necessarily with absolute power in any obvious sense, but with all the power necessary to defer whatever violence he must have originally deferred, and whatever new potential forms of violence his presence might generate. This means that even if we're not thinking about the man at the center all the time, maybe the animal god at the center wasn't thought about explicitly all the time either, we are still thinking about him in the sense of thinking in his vicinity, on ground covered by him. When we pay attention to something else with others, that space is bounded by the knowledge that under certain conditions, it could become the business of the occupant of the center. So built into your attention to anything or anyone on the margin is the need to imitate the thing or person, to imitate its own centrality, preserve and frame its existence, but to do so in such a way as to keep the occupant of the center out of it, where him getting into it would undermine your relation to that thing or person, and to bring him into it in a way favorable to you if that becomes necessary. The more distant and invisible the occupant of the center is, then, the more thoroughly he shapes the contours of your thinking and action. If we could peek into the thinking of any modern-day citizen, we would find attached to any thought or action some way of shaping it so as to make potential authoritative intervention reinforcing. Now, of course, the most significant demystification is that of the occupant of the center himself. This as well can only happen through the creation of a competing center, not through some logical reasoning about the occupant of the center really just being a man like us, capable of mistakes and crimes and so on, much less speculations regarding our own really ontological priority to the center. The occupant of the center must itself or himself create this alternate center. And the way he does so is by persecuting one who will come to be or refer to its occupant. For this to happen, we have to assume there are already other centers of power, each subordinate and accountable to some imperial center, and yet independent enough to attract attention in its own right. A certain kind of attention can be brought to bear on what we can oxymoronically or paradoxically call this marginal center, and which would intensify the attention directed towards it. This new kind of attention would be excessive, in the sense that it would reverse previous forms of attention paid to what was once a favored subject, and become incommensurable with the danger posed by any actual transgression. Somehow the existence of the imperial center is itself placed at stake, perhaps in a long-term perspective, and such a perspective is itself encouraged by empires claiming to be eternal. And so that persecuted subject, or what I have called the exemplary victim, indicates a new center to which even the imperial center is subordinate. This new center, which can't be adequately named or represented in itself, but only in transgressions against it, is the source of all demystifications. The revelation is that our adherence to the imperial center perpetuates persecution incommensurable to anything the persecuted could possibly deserve. This new center can't be demystified. Only particular claimants to it can be. If you ask anyone how they can claim to have demystified or debunked any claim to truth or authority, that is, to centrality, they will necessarily put another centrality in its place, whether they refer to facts, reason, God-given rights, faith, or technological performativity. They are asking you to imitate their imitation of a being modeling what is more real than reality, some transcendent arbiter whom we disobey at the risk of plunging blindly into destructive persecution. Once such a center exists, though, everyone wants to occupy it. And such claims become a way of demanding others affirm their centrality. The legacy of the exemplary victim is that anyone could potentially become a center, because anyone could become the exemplary victim by representing some truth incommensurable with the system, which is ultimately how we imagine ourselves as subjects. But this means that as subjects, we can only compose our own centrality as defiance towards some tyrannical center, against which we invoke the ultimate judgment of the higher center, as in, history will prove I'm right. That is, if we look far enough into the future, the really important people will agree with me. How can we demystify this most resistant form of illusory centrality? Well, let's return to the beginning. In the beginning, we're created by the thing at the center, some this, which becomes it as we repeatedly refer to it. We preserve, protect, and obey it, and devote our attention to determining good ways to approach it, to name it, to appease it, to keep it at the center. This is first of all done through ritual, which prescribes very precise and rigorously enforced ways of engaging it. Since we now know that any form of authority is contingent, that we contribute to its maintenance, ritual can't work anymore to preserve it. But we can still make it possible to say this in a way that will secure attention and to refer to other thises, which will eventually become its. In other words, build a world of reliable reference points, populated, at least potentially, by figures able to defer their own centrality to the benefit of the social center. This involves the creation of disciplinary spaces where things are systematically let be, in a secured setting where we devote ourselves to finding better ways of talking about things and talking about what we're talking about. Now, this is not simply a question of methods or procedures, because identifying the form of authority we invoke is always part of the practice. The only it's that will endure are those that enable us to distinguish between center and centrality. This means creating ostensives, positing things we could look at and name, where there is or might be some convergence on the object. This is why the notion of political formalism is so important, because a genuine name unites power and responsibility. It creates a marginal center we can imitate in our expectations and judgments. This is the only way we can refrain from indulging in the extraordinarily powerful attraction of the role of the exemplary victim, the one who is denounced or ignored by all, but whom history will vindicate. Entering another space, one prepared to issue denunciations, can only be done in the interest of clarifying names and sorting out thises and its. All references to oneself as a center to be expelled in the name of consolidating the group must be referred back to some it or this that is being evoked to justify the expulsion. If we share attention to that model, the expulsion then becomes impossible, but the reversion into persecuted opposition is also deferred in the name of contributing reference points to the founding concepts of the space. This won't always work, but it's the only thing that would ultimately be worth making work. Okay, that's all for that.
Okay, well, I might as well jump in. It seems like there's actually quite a lot of relevance here between what you've just described and what we were talking about before the recording started. Because this notion of, okay, so you have leftists, let's say, in general. Okay, well, they've got lots of good reasons why the system sucks and why, the capitalists are exploiting us, man, or whatever, and they can make those arguments quite well. But there's a big difference between doing so and then proposing, okay, so what? Are we just going to all get together and feel sorry for each other for our exploitation? Or are we going to actually propose something that could challenge that center and affirm it, right? And so I was talking about my frustration with these leftists that are unable to see, okay, well, right-wing populism has come along and it says, here's a way the center could actually be occupied in such a way that we could have class collaboration and that we could fight back against all of these, globalist processes of by which capital centralizes its power in this kind of very malicious way. But that disgusts them because it's like, oh, well, you guys are just, authoritarians. You're trying to impose just more capitalism on me. They don't actually have a way of distinguishing between the two, because I think it's almost impossible in their moral outlook to think outside of victims, as you say. And for anyone to actually occupy sovereignty in such a way that it would be virtuous and magnificent and all of these things. What we're also seeing in the culture right now is people are imagining that the center could actually be occupied again in a meaningful way, not just by a placeholder that no one takes seriously as having any real power. I felt like this in particular when I saw Trump move in all of these loyalists into the Pentagon a couple of days ago. And he cleaned the whole thing out. And apparently the CIA director has been fired or is about to be fired as well. I've been trying to see who he appoints there. But all the people that he put into the Pentagon are like totally awesome. Like they're all worked their way up through the military. They actually fought in wars. They're all from the military. They're not, and none of them are civilians. And you can go on like their Twitters and they're, talking shit to John Brennan about how he's treasonous and doing Obama conspiracy theories and how Muslims are invading Europe, and they're like all like red-pilled military men. And so I was like, okay, this is cool because this would be the ground. If the center could be occupied, it would be securing that institution. And then from the basis of securing that institution, providing a platform for engaging in conflict and kind of recapture of the institutions around the government, the other departments of the state and so forth, and outside the state that are kind of the state by other means, like the media and so forth. And so that hope, I think a lot of people are feeling that same hope, that, okay, maybe we could actually have someone who would be able to wield power and say, you're an enemy. We're going to do this, 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 and this, and actually be able to get it done. And that feels incredibly good to someone like me, but it seems like these people can't really perceive that in moral terms at all. That's, oh no, this could be a coup, a fascist coup. This is terrible. We're all going to be oppressed. And they can't see the writings on the wall with all of this oppression that's already coming down upon us. I mean, we've all been basically under house arrest to various degrees this year at certain points. And these things are only going to get worse if this isn't done. So I think that's quite powerful language that you're talking about here, which is ultimately, I think, relates back as well to like Bergson's idea, which is Bergson's philosophy in a very simple way is ultimately there is no objects insofar outside of perception. There are forces and there are things that acting upon us, intentions and so forth. But there's no objects insofar as they like to have these like discrete entities separate from other things. The intervals and separations between things we oppose upon reality for practical contingency. So what he's saying is, okay, there's no objects, but there's forces, there's tensions, and there's practicality. These things are more real than objects. And so this inquiry into what is practicality immediately presupposes a practice, obviously. And then so as soon as you start having to imagine a practice as having a temporality, you have to imagine goal creation, you have to imagine hierarchies, and you have to imagine some kind of process by which an object has its intelligibility in its relation to something that we're trying to do. And so this is what I see as the main political problem, as you were saying before. A lot of these leftists, they just want to criticize capitalism, and that's it. We've got this great criticism, this great explanation about how we're victimized and we're done. They don't actually want to affirm an alternative. They don't actually want to affirm how could we actually practice something that could win, and they don't seem to pay any respect. Like if something is not perfect, it's not ideologically perfect. You see it even with white nationalists as well. If something isn't ideologically perfect, well then it's all the same as whatever else was occurring, when it's actually radically different. And because there's no sense of what is practically possible that is really driving their political objects, so to speak. They're just living in this abstract world, this fantasy world, basically. And so I think bringing all that back, all that together from the ontological level up to the moral and the political level, I think your description does this quite well. I mean, I don't really have questions because I think I understand what you're saying, so I don't really need any clarification, but I mean, that's what I was kind of getting. In any
well,
case.
and I want to say after, as I was watching that whole Twitter kind of engagement last night, I was really, it was really remarkable, and I was a bit overwhelmed by the way that so many people were kind of stepping in and kind of using this sort of language, and you could see that there was no way Nitzan and Bickler could have anything to say to it, right? I mean, all they could do is keep falling back on, well, what wouldn't this lead to a dictator and stuff like that, right? I mean, they couldn't really get at the more fundamental ontological questions. I mean, they couldn't, if you asked them what would be a real authority, you could see that they just have to find, they can't say the word without say how it would have to be constrained and controlled and subservient to something else, and that something else that it would be subservient to, they can't say what it is really. It's just some generic direct democracy or autonomy, or just like everybody being good with each other is kind of the best they can do with that. So it's really amazing that none of these people, I mean, no liberal really can say the word authority without immediately saying, oh, but of course I mean, authority subordinated to this, controlled by this, determined by this, defined by this, checked by this, overseen by this, and so on, right? They always have to put that tag there. And that tag is brings us back to exactly this pattern, right? The exemplary victim. And that's why Black Lives Matter works the way it works, right? I mean, you need, this particular victim who suffered in such a way. Again, it's not just the suffering. It's not just that someone died. It's not even just that somebody died when they shouldn't have died or unjustly. It's someone who died and in dying exposed the system for what it really is, right? Now we see the system for what it really is once and for all. It's kind of exposed, right? It's kind of a revelation. And then once you have that, this feeds directly into, because you need this to justify singling out, the persecutor. right? Because now you can target the persecutor who did this thing. Ultimately, I mean, you may have to go through some detours and this some indirection here and so on, but ultimately it's kind of this way of thinking and this group of people who led to this exemplary victim. And if we clean them out, then that would presumably do what? In a sense, they can't even say what it would do. Would it put an end to victims altogether? In a sense, they can't really even imagine that either, because their thinking is so deeply rooted. They can only think about, in a sense, you could say, the thrill of organizing themselves over and over again around some exemplary victim against some centered target, right? And so, yeah, any talk of authority is kind of, in a sense, it blocks their thinking, because this is the only way they could think. And the more you can get them saying, yeah, I mean, well, what would you do, and who would do it, and how would you have them do it, and how would you have them deal with people who get in the way of them doing it, and so on, just kind of following their own logic. And in a sense, they just, they kind of turn you off, right? They can't pursue that line of thinking, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think this notion that there's a center and all the time, and every time you're talking to someone, every time you're looking at something, there's a center, and there's a center because there's a social center, really kind of sustaining that that discourse, that logic. I think we'll get more powerful, and yeah, I mean, I agree that whatever you think of Trump and whatever is going to come of Trump, he's giving us a much better look at what this would entail than anyone has for a very long time, and which means we should very, very closely as we can, so that if we have to, we can remember things, right? And know what to look for, if something like this, becomes possible again.
Well, I already called it. The liberal democracy has already ended. It's just, I mean, I posted this on my Twitter today that I think it was 86% of Trump supporters, according to one poll, think the election was rigged against Trump or something like that. And there's other polls where the number's a bit lower, but it was like 70% or something. And we know that the polls are fake, right? So you can add a tax. But the point is that the vast majority of Trump supporters, they no longer trust in democracy. So if they don't trust in democracy, but they trust in Trump, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It obviously means something quite significant. They don't even realize what it means yet. And the Jim blog, Jim's blog or whatever, he made the same point that when Caesar came to power in Rome, he did so to defend the Republic, and he probably sincerely thought he was doing so, and so will Trump. But it's impossible to defend the Republic and against its enemies, whilst at the same time preserving liberal democracy. Because, I mean, what are you going to do? We're just going to have Chinese agents rigging elections because, that's we're going to keep liberal democracy together. I mean, obviously that's ridiculous. So it's done. You can put the only question is, how is it going to be done?
Yeah.
Obviously, the ideal would be that he manages to do. I said basically, I think of sovereignty as having three fundamental constituent parts. I just kind of bullshitted this out of my ass, but it seems to make sense. Which is one, you need to have, you need to formally perform. So you need to have like all the courts and the laws and the titles and everything to line up. You need to have enforcement, which is why those Pentagon moves were so critical. And the formal performance would come down to these court cases in the Supreme Court and the legislatures and so forth. But on both these fronts, we're seeing a lot of good signs. And then the third front is essentially legitimacy through propaganda, at least social, media coordination, you could say, if you want to say it a bit nicely. And the reality is that this PSYOP failed because the PSYOP wasn't actually directed at Biden supporters. The PSYOP was directed at Trump supporters, and it's failed. It hasn't demoralized them. I mean, it might have demoralized some, but it's failed. The reality is that the right has its own parallel media, parallel memes, and so forth that has immunized it over the past 5 years, and that has prepared us for this moment. And so it was impossible for them to capture our world. We now have our own separate world. It's got its own icons and its own words and its own meanings and its individuals, and they're connected into a social group. And I'm sure that this Saturday will be a historic demonstration of that in Washington, D.C. And so if these three things line up, I mean, it's checkmate as far as I'm concerned. I don't really see what they can do. I mean, if they can destabilize any of these three things, I don't think I mean, the formal legitimacy is probably the only aspect. But I think once you have the other two aspects, I feel like the formal legitimacy is the easiest thing to actually drive through. So
yeah, I mean, you've got if all this is going to the courts, and the courts have been kind of significantly staffed by Trump over the past 4 years, right? The higher it gets up into the federal court, the more favorable the decisions to Trump are going to be, and also in all these swing states, these are things I didn't even realize. I didn't even realize that the state legislature is what decides to send the electors to Congress, right? So
the governors do, apparently. That's what the media is telling us, because that's customarily how it works. But if you have a bunch of originalists in the Supreme Court, it clearly says in the Constitution the legislatures. Governors aren't legislatures.
Right. And so I mean, one possibility is that in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, they decide this was such a mess that we can't ever sort it out, so we're just going to kind of assume that that Trump won, and send because they're all controlled by Republicans, all of these state legislatures, so all of them can do that. If they want to sue, if Biden wants to sue, it goes up to the Supreme Court, and if you just read the Constitution, that's the way it says it works. And in a sense, this would be extremely interesting, because the actual, let's say, empirical question of who actually got more votes, if we could actually get back into tabulating kind of legally cast votes, in a sense, we'd be saying we're never going to know that. And if we end up kind of acknowledging, I mean, I think in a sense we can know it, but in a sense formally it would sort of be acknowledged that that's not even the question anymore, right? The question is whether that level of authoritative kind of delegation, of authoritative, kind of sort of elevation of someone to power, that level doesn't work anymore, and now we need to shift to another level. And once you could shift to another level and say that's it's the state representatives who can say, well, no, the election was was kind of inconclusive, and there's nothing we can do about it, but we're nevertheless going to send this these electors to Trump. Then if it shifts in that way, it can kind of shift in other ways as well, right? And it will be weird, because all of these really kind of almost like antique features of the Constitution. These are like the most like baroque and bizarre and antique features of the Constitution that haven't really been in play for, I don't know if they were ever really in play, right? That state representatives, I don't know if there's ever been really like a dispute that led to the state representatives kind of countering, the popular vote or setting aside the popular vote. I don't think that's ever happened. So this is like some provision in the Constitution that's never actually been realized. And now all of a sudden, and it's the most ancient thing that, the idea that states are real, right? And that state representatives are somehow more legitimate than kind of votes cast by people in the state. This really is kind of what the founders of the Constitution did assume. This is the way they were thinking about it. And all of that stuff would come back and would have to be defended. And would have to be defended, you'd have to do, this kind of just follows up on what you were saying, right? I mean, if you think about how you then have to address the media, and how you'd have to address the intelligence agencies, and how you'd have to address the tech companies, apparently there's all kinds of irregularities with the computer, the computer kind of software that was used to tabulate the votes. They're getting into this now. Apparently, this was just kind of shifting votes from Biden to Trump automatically, and that was it seems that was the original plan, as best as we could tell now. But then Trump was winning by too much, and it wasn't shifting enough votes over to Biden. So that's when they had to kind of start shoveling in all of these crazy other votes from from mail-in ballots, and just kind of filling ballots out and stuff like that. And then the last couple of days, there's this whole Maidengate thing, which kind of just opens up things way beyond that, going way back as well. I don't know if you've been following that.
there's so many aspects to it, but I think the key. I mean, it's obvious fraud because what convinced me was the mathematical analysis. When I was following it in real time, and I was like, "This makes no sense."
Yeah, right.
There's so many data irregularities that it's obvious.
Yeah, I mean, after Florida and Ohio, Michigan and Pennsylvania couldn't have gone the way they went.
Yeah, but we were all hanging out in the Discord, and he was up by like 800,000 votes in Pennsylvania. It was like, okay, well, that's sorted, and we're just kind of eyeing off. Well, Michigan's looking pretty good. We just need that to drop, and we're home, kind of thing. And yeah, but
and then they stopped counting.
yeah, it was obvious. I mean, it's obvious to us, but it wasn't obvious to them. But it was obvious to us. It was obvious to the people who matter. But I think the key that picks the lock in this is ultimately that what this is required is Trump had to get the GOP to fight existentially, and so not only he has had to drag the party through this process. If he ultimately wins, he will have forced the GOP to ultimately stand up for itself for the first time. Even Nixon wouldn't stand up for himself in this situation. So he's completely changed that. He's destroyed Fox. He's destroyed Fox completely. And if he succeeds, that means he must have the backing of key generals in the Pentagon. He must. And he must have the backing of defense intelligence, because he wouldn't be able to pull this off if they weren't cooperating with him. And so all the pieces would be fitting together. He would have the court. He would have had to have basically lined all the chess pieces up and put the opponent into checkmate, in which case that's significant, because ultimately then that activates this new possibility in a way that has this legitimate narration from the past, where American conservatism can flow through it. He hasn't come into the system and like changed the system. He's come into the system and tried to make it honest on its own terms, and like forced this scenario out into play, if that makes sense. And so American nationalism will now have this authenticity where it has this authentic narration from the Republic and the goals and the standards of what America was supposed to be. That'll have this narrative flow that'll continue into the process. It's not some foreign ideology. It's nothing like fascism or like revolutionary communism or any of these movements in the past, because ultimately it would be, basically in terms of its moral structure, it'll be, this is us trying to play by the rules, and we just keep getting forced by the enemy to basically obliterate. The enemy is basically the one responsible for destroying liberalism, not us. We're just kind of defending ourselves morally within this framework, and we just kept getting pushed into this awareness. And so that, I think, is what makes this powerful, because Trump's whole message of class collaboration, it's so organic. You know what I mean? It's not like he's come across with this, he's opened a book of ideology and said, this is what we need to do. And he's like some revolutionary. He's trying to narrate the American experience. He's trying to give, that's what people voted for him for, because they're like, okay, this guy's trying to actually make America great again. He's actually trying to do what the country's supposed to do. And all this process of like referring back to the Constitution, it produces all of these continuities with other periods in American history. I think this makes this moment incredibly powerful, because it doesn't have any artificiality to it. And the enemy, it's like a perfect cartoon enemy in many ways as well. It has all the spices you would need to cook up a kind of post-liberal drive. So I think no matter what happens, even if Trump was to fail, this would militarize the right, and the right would push for some kind of heartland secession or some kind of way of achieving the franchise. I think this, even if Trump has to go down as a martyr, this is still, I don't see the movement dissipating. So,
look, and to add to that, this was actually, and this is one more reason for assuming that there was massive fraud here. This was actually a very bad election for the left and for the Democrats. They lost very badly in Congress. They're not going to lose the majority, it seems, but they lost quite a few seats, and they didn't gain. I think I read that not a single Republican incumbent lost a seat
There was one House seat where the Republican won, but Joe Biden got 75% of the vote or something.
Well,
How does that make sense?
There's all kinds of anomalies like this, and obviously the anomalies add up to. I mean, again, all of those votes that just voted for Biden and didn't kind of fill in anyone down ballot, right? So you have like 900,000 people who just voted for Biden but didn't vote for a congressional candidate or a Senate candidate or any local candidates or anything like that, which never really happens. I mean, a few people might do that. I could imagine doing that if I just wanted to vote for Trump but I hated the Republicans. I might leave all that blank. So some people will do it, but not that many people, especially if it's an anti-Trump election and you're saying everybody's coming out to fight against Trump, they'd vote for all Democrats all the way down the line if that were the case, right? So yeah, I mean, there's just tons of stuff which again gets completely discussed and focused on very kind of carefully and meticulously on one side, and gets just completely ignored and dismissed on the other. So they have a headline, national election officials say there was no fraud, which is basically saying all the people around the election say there was no election fraud. Well, okay, I mean, what do you expect them to say? Yeah, we ran that would count as evidence. That's the only evidence you'll accept. The actual people ran the election saying, yeah, we committed massive fraud.
Giuliani made the point. He's saying there's no evidence. He's like, I'm standing next to someone who was a witness who has signed an affidavit that this happened. Like, this guy right here, that's evidence.
They don't think
how do you think court works? You call witnesses to the stand, you ask them questions. Like,
they think that's hearsay. They think people actually seen something as hearsay, right? Or that somehow you need a video now. But of course, if it were a video, they would say it's a doctored video, right? Which it could be. You could doctor a video.
There is videos too.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Like. The media's putting out, the Trump lawsuit. It's nothing. It doesn't even allege It doesn't even allege fraud. I said, well, if you look at the lawsuit, it alleges that, well, it's not possible to determine the fraudulence of the ballots because no one was there to verify them to see if they were fraudulent or not. But the fact that they are not letting us look at them suggests that they must, like, if they were fraudulent, why wouldn't they let us look at them? Like, it's. You know what I mean? And then now apparently they've destroyed the evidence or something. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure if you illegally obstruct someone from verifying something and then destroy it before they can come and audit it, that's an admission of guilt. Like any sane court is going to see that as such.
Yeah, and I think by now there are enough sane courts that and that realize it's gotten really existential for the Republicans. And a good sign was actually, if you noticed, McConnell, the first couple of days after the election was kind of quiet, and then Barr went and spoke with him, and then after that, McConnell went to the Senate and made a speech saying, the president is 100% within his rights to pursue all of these, all these legal challenges and so on. So something happened there, right? I mean, they showed McConnell something, and they showed him something that related to the Senate as well, right?
There's something happened in Georgia as well, because the Georgia governor and Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor were talking it down. I don't think the Georgia governor didn't even say anything. And then they sent a bunch of Republican operatives down there, and now all of a sudden they're doing a full audit and hand recount.
Yeah.
So they must. I'm sure they're going to do similar thing. Will probably happen in Arizona soon, I think, as well. I think they've got something, because Trump and Giuliani have been dropping bombs about this Dominion thing, and CIA whistleblowers said that they have evidence. That they have the evidence that they need, and they're laying a trap, essentially.
That's right. Look, and in a sense, kind of, if that weren't the case, then all the Republicans would be repudiating them, because they wouldn't want to be dragged down with this, right? And that's obviously not happening. That's what happened.
It's going to be an interesting few weeks, because this has got a few weeks to run. So there's going to be a lot of moves and counter moves. And obviously, but I think a telling sign was John Brennan. It's only been 9 days since the election, and he comes out on MSNBC the other night, and he's shitting himself already. And he's saying, well, Mike Pence should 25th Amendment Trump. He's obviously unfit. It's like, obviously, you're scared of something, man, because it's only been 9 days and you're coming out. You're blinking first. So I think
Yeah,
that
I
actually
mean,
meant a lot.
the funny thing about it, this is all about the center as well, in a sense, right? That you know, just in terms of what's more interesting, right? If you're a thinking person, if you're a curious, inquisitive person, what's more interesting? Looking into all of these things, even if you're not sure, even if you're kind of very skeptical about the claims of fraud, isn't all this stuff really interesting? Looking into these affidavits, looking into these possibilities of hacking computers, and so on. I mean, like, wouldn't I mean? Again, even just to disprove it or argue with people, I mean, you would think that would be a lot more interesting than kind of speculating about, who will Biden choose for Secretary of State or something like
Yeah,
that. Right? I mean, which is like the most boring kind of thing to talk about, right? The most, conventional, you
some people have
know.
this ridiculous position that somehow, like Trump, is like this scapegoat that we can just sacrifice and everything will go back to normal. When, if anything, it's the total opposite. I don't know. I mean, again, this is probably just the same kind of dynamics of the center that you're describing. This.
Yeah, I mean, Trump doesn't play the victim, right? He doesn't play the sacrificial victim, right? I mean, he'll kind of draw them in that way to a certain extent, but he always claims to be a winner, right? That's what distinguishes him. He doesn't say, in 50 years, people will say I'm the greatest president ever, precisely because you're destroying me, right? I mean, which is kind of an invitation to destroy you, right? He doesn't speak like that at all, right? He
No, he
always
says we'll win. He said, what he said in the speech on election night. He said, frankly, we should have won tonight, and frankly, we did win tonight. And that was a very powerful statement. And then when he also predicted, and at 4 a.m., I don't want to see any funny business dropped. And then it's precisely what happened. It was like they knew what was happening ahead of time.
Yeah.
They'd already war gamed it out, and they could see what the enemy was going to do. And the fact that he's just off playing golf and just chilling, like he seems pretty relaxed. Like I do feel like they've got stuff in the works.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at them, they're all completely confident. Everyone on his team. And,
Pompeo is confident. He's giggling away.
Nothing, yeah. All these people would be scurrying away if they thought this wasn't going to happen. They'd all be scurrying away. They'd all be resigning. They'd all be jumping to the other side. They'd all be saying Trump has to quit, and so on. None of them are saying that. The only ones who are saying that are people who are kind of out of office, out of power. These kind of irrelevant pundits who
like neocons and shit.
Like what?
Like neocons, basically, that he kicked out of the party.
Yeah, I mean, people who were in Congress 20 years ago or something, so they put together like 300 former Republican office holders, and you look at them. I recognized a few names on the list, and they're like people who haven't been in power, like haven't been in office for like 15, 20 years already. So what are they doing? They're basically lobbyists now, probably. So so you get them to sign anything that you want, right? So they can't really get anybody important to to repudiate Trump, and nobody seems to draw conclusions from this, right? And they don't draw conclusions from the fact that they've had these moments where they thought they had him so many times and it never came off.
Yeah, they could never make it stick.
This will be different, right? I mean, how many of these people who were saying, "Don't worry, of course he's gone. Biden will be, inaugurated." So, how many of those people were saying in 2017 or 2018, "Oh, he's out. He's finished. This is it. The walls are closing in. He's going to be."
And everyone seems to have forgotten the fact that they have Biden dead to rights on so many charges as well. So they can easily get Biden to back down once they win. They can say, "Hey, do you want to go to jail? Yes or no?" I mean, they got a chip. I assume that's what they used on Clinton, because I was surprised that Clinton backed down, and I assumed that was the same chip they used there.
Yeah, maybe. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, it could be.
But I mean, it seems like the evidence with Biden seems a lot more extensive than with Clinton. I mean, Giuliani built a case. And then you see Giuliani driving around in a car with what looked like a bunch of mafiosos smoking cigars. You think, I mean, I have heard speculations that Trump is connected with the Italian mafia, the Russian mafia, various other groups. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's this whole underground network that we don't know about that maybe in 20 years they'll write books about and we'll find out.
Well, there's no doubt that Trump has networks going way back. He's got his own security and intelligence services and so on. But what I've also heard, and that seems to be very plausible and would account for his close connection to Giuliani, is that back in the 80s, Trump was actually helping with the mafia busting work, and with Giuliani and the FBI and the prosecutor's office there. And and even that whole opening of a casino in Atlantic City, which Trump did back then, and it turned out to be a total failure. I think this casino never really got off the ground, but that may have been, him sort of becoming an informant for the FBI and helping them, bust, these kind of these mafia enterprises that were controlling Atlantic City and other places as well. So that, then that would account for all kinds of connections that he would have.
It's been pointed out by the Q-tards that he is listed as a witness on the FBI investigation into Epstein as well. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, which is why the left never really pushes too much on that, even though you have like these pictures of him with Epstein. But no one ever no one ever really ever tries to make too much of that. Nobody high up anyway. I always see like maybe some random Twitter, guy will kind of post that picture of Trump with Epstein, but no, it doesn't seem anyone ever really tried to do much with it.
I was just watching his speech at Davos at the beginning of the year today, and he basically turned up to Davos, particularly after you read bits in Nicholas' book. Basically what he did was turn up to Davos and just flex on them. He was just like, the bottom 10% have increased their earnings at a faster rate than the top 10% for the first time in recorded history. And all these poor people are doing great and they're all getting jobs and we're reindustrializing and America's creating trade deals for its own benefit. And he was just listing off all of his achievements, and you could see it was just kind of him showing up and giving a middle finger to all of them in a certain way, which is quite interesting that he would. Why would he bother to turn up and do that? And I thought, it does seem like he is conscious of who the enemy is. I don't think he's like some kind of bumbling idiot. So it is possible that this final confrontation was kind of the plan all along. In many ways, was to kind of force this scenario, forcing their hand by by making certain moves that made them afraid of prosecution and and so forth, and getting them to try and steal an election, because then this forces this scenario where he can then try and make all these moves in the government, and this would then enable him to have the ability to make radical changes where it was not politically possible before, when he had to operate within the auspices of business as usual American.
Yeah, which would also account for why they're trying this now, why they're pulling out all the stops and going all in to try and stop him now. Yeah, I mean that's the most plausible thing I could think of. I mean, the whole idea that that people say that he's kind of lazy, doesn't pay attention, he's kind of egocentric and so on. I mean, no one seems to notice. It doesn't really explain anything, right? I mean, if that were all the case, why weren't they able to get rid of him in like 2018? Right? I mean, the idea that he's kind of a step ahead of everyone.
How do you win in the first place? I mean, apparently they had this software then, so either he beat Hillary by 3% everywhere, or he somehow got it shut down or negated it in some way. I mean, the Democrats, it's not like this is the first election the Democrats have attempted to steal. They've just taken it up a level with the absentee ballots and all that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the fact that he was I didn't believe that he would be allowed to win when I was hoping he was going to win in 2016, but I was shocked because I thought they would rig it. Not that I thought he was unpopular. So
it could be, it's still risky, right? To rig an election, especially a national election on that scale, and it could be they really thought they would win. I do think they really thought that they would win. They believe their own hype.
I don't understand how they could believe their own hype. I mean, these people have they're not stupid. Like the idea that Hillary is just this incompetent political operative, I don't buy that. I mean, she knows what she's doing. I think they had a plan to steal it, and it was foiled. I mean, I think if they do have this computer technology, this stuff was used last time. This company existed before. And the people who came out days before the election who were saying hammer and scorecard, they're going to get used in the election, and the CIA whistleblowers had connections to, Montgomery, the guy who built the Hammer software and so forth. They said this was going to happen, and they said they used it last time and they were obstructed. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's all hearsay because it's all classified.
Yeah, I mean, it's all stuff maybe we'll know more about down the road, right? Right now you can only, like you look at the picture, right, and you could just see, if this is happening, then this other thing, to say this other thing doesn't make sense, right? And there is this kind of common sense dimension to it, right? I mean, like for me, like for you, it seems it was late at night, and I was kind of staying up late, and I didn't think it was even going to take that long after Florida came through so strongly. I didn't even think it was going to take that long, and then all of a sudden it started dragging out, and and again, if you look at past elections and the relationship between Florida and Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. So why should he have done so much better this time in Florida and even better in Ohio, but then so much worse in Michigan and Pennsylvania?
And what were the Trafalgar polls that were correct about all these others, like all the kind of Trump polling that we were I presume you were following as well, that was criticizing the mainstream polling. They predicted all the other states correctly. They said that Trump had a lead in Pennsylvania and Michigan. He was up 3% in Michigan and up 4% in Pennsylvania, roughly speaking, according to those polls. So, I mean, those other polls obfuscated that and made it easier for them to pull this off, which gives you an incentive as to why.
And in a sense, you could really almost just watch the enemy to see what the truth is, right? Because obviously, if everything was on the up and up and it was a perfectly fine election, they would say, okay, let's play out the process, because that's what they did in 2000, right? I mean, Al Gore didn't start like announcing, his cabinet and meeting with foreign leaders and calling himself the president-elect and so on. They understood that that there were legal challenges, and the legal challenges have to play out and so on. And that's what they would be doing now, and they would be confident that would work in their favor, and they would even participate in that. And they would say, I mean, Gore back then, they wanted more recounts. They wanted to look at more votes. They were kind of pushing the boundaries a bit there as well, but not in a very egregious way, right? But now, no, you can't look at anything. You're a conspiracy theorist if you want to look at anything. And so you look at that and you just see, okay, if this was really a legitimate election, they wouldn't be acting this way, right? There's no other explanation for them acting this way other than they know that the more we see and the more that gets exposed, the worse it is for them. So in a sense, you can get very simple. You can get into all the weeds of exactly how you hack computers and all the statistical anomalies and so on. And obviously, people are doing that. And that's all very important and interesting. But in a certain sense, you don't really need to do that. You just have to kind of look at how a few major players respond to everything, and that kind of tells you what you need to know. Well, we got some questions here, so we can kind of look at them. So, all right, there's John's question about Trump having actual power over the DOD. Well, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, we'll find out soon enough about that. That's probably more a question for you, but
I don't think he'd be. I mean, I guess that is something that will be performed. I don't think the Joint Chiefs of Staff will violate the Constitution if he can be declared formally the winner. It'd be unprecedented for them to do a military coup.
Yeah, why would they? Right? I mean,
yeah, and so I think that's the key. I mean, by the same token, I don't think they would back him if he didn't win formally for the same reason. But I think there is a lot of evidence that he is being supported by certain members of the defense intelligence apparatus, and that there is a lot of evidence that there is a faction in defense intelligence and security apparatus that has a major rivalry with the CIA and many aspects of the globalist agenda, which played out in these kinds of skirmishes that they had, particularly in Syria. That was, I think, one side giving ISIS the weapons and the other side having to fight them, for example. But also apparently General Flynn and the generals loyal to General Flynn that constituted this faction allegedly disobeying Obama's order to fire on the Russians in Syria, and that was apparently the beginning of this process, where by refusing to comply, it was like we're no longer going along with these guys, and that was the beginning of the Trump movement essentially, because they started moving things into play. The other speculation I have, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but it's just kind of something that seems like it makes sense, is that the Q movement is a PSYOP, like a defense intelligence PSYOP, because I just remember like looking through it on Twitter before it all got wiped out from Twitter, to a large extent, and thinking and just analyzing the different accounts and the different YouTube channels and how artificial so much of it looked. It just didn't look like it was this authentic bunch of people on the internet by any means. It had very like obvious narrative plans, and like a lot of the accounts didn't look like legitimate Twitter accounts that had normal users and so forth. And so it seemed like that whole program that was kind of being pushed out there was being pushed by someone. And it seems like this kind of gives evidence for a kind of counter psyop to accompany Trump's presidency. Obviously, there's been authentic alternative media, but it does seem like there's some kind of intelligence support for these factions in certain ways, much like the regular media obviously has a lot of intelligence support. And so when I put two and two together, it feels like, okay, if there is this faction in the US military and Trump has been able to get this far, chances are that those guys behind the scenes must have positioned themselves in a certain way to make this move. But I guess the proof will be in the pudding.